welcome to Ecofeminism. I'm your instructor, Rachel Hansen. If you've never been here before, I'm glad to have you. If you have been here before, also very glad to have you. I do have a little bit of housekeeping to kind of help us get rolling. And let's see, I just wanted to make sure that my microphone was doing what I wanted it to be doing. So this space on Substack is called Gender and Women's Studies. This space was really born out of me having the credentials to teach feminist studies at the college level and not really finding a job to teach feminist studies at the college level. But I still really like doing it. So that's what this space is for. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to put them in the chat. The only thing that I really don't want in the chat ever are comments on my appearance. This may shock you, but I am a woman on the internet. So I already know what I look like. I don't need you to tell me. But otherwise, pretty much everything else is fair game. We can engage each other in good faith back and forth. Now, these next 6 weeks, as we're talking about ecofeminism, it does feel a little bit like cheating to call it 6 weeks because it's really 5 weeks of content and then 1 week of reflection for our last week. So, but there is a syllabus for this course. Now, so far, I'm about to close out my first full year in this space on Substack. I've always made a syllabus, and for whatever reason, it didn't actually occur to me to share it. So I am doing that this time. It's linked in the written module for this week. So if you want to read ahead or what have you, you can access that syllabus. Of course, the links will also be in the modules delivered to your inbox every Sunday morning. So important to note is there's free access to everything that we are reading together over these next few weeks. But if there are any of the books that we are using that you would like to purchase on your own, I do have a Linktree shop where all those books are linked. And if you purchase through shop, I do make a small commission without any extra cost to you. And then again, been around for a while, you know that this is a change, but you might not know this is a change if you're brand new. And that is that the written modules will be coming out on Sundays instead of on Mondays. But Wednesday continues to be really the best day for these Substack lives. I was actually originally thinking about the idea of going on Monday nights instead, but I'm a member of the Tolkien Society. And just for funsies, I'm going to put a link to the Tolkien Society in the chat. And we are doing what they are calling the Big Read this year. And the intent is to read, of course, all of the Lord of the Rings trilogy and The Hobbit and the Silmarillion. It's basically just a big old book club for the Lord of the Rings. And we meet every other Monday. So that toying about with the Monday evening lectures was very short-lived. So all of this, all of me running my mouth, brings us into like our first piece of reading for the week. And that is an essay called Ecofeminism and Grassroots Environmentalism in the United States. It's an essay that is found in a book called Toxic Struggles, the Theory and practice of environmental justice. And it was published in 1993. Now, within any edition of this book, this article by Barbara Epstein can be found on pages 144 to 152. So it's kind of towards the end of this book of essays. And I really wanted to start with this essay because Epstein does a really fantastic job of telling us what ecofeminism is anyway. And that might be the curiosity that is bringing you into this space right now. And what she has to say is that ecofeminism appeared as both an intellectual and a political trend at the intersection of the feminist, environmental, and peace movements. And also that patriarchy, the domination of women by men, has also been associated with the domination of nature. So in short, right, like academics, we really like our jargon. Ecofeminism is the idea that patriarchy is responsible for the demolition of nature, and that those that hold an ecofeminist attitude are attempting to restore balance by promoting healing within nature. Now, maybe not surprisingly at all, ecofeminism is really kind of like an intellectual movement that got some serious traction in the late 1970s with other anti-war protest movements. As an aside, I hope that wherever you are, that you are staying hydrated. Where I am in North America, it is both really hot and there's some wildfires to the north of me, so it's really smoky. So just trying to stay hydrated over here too. But right at the time, of course, there was a lot of anti-war protests going on, kind of starting in with the Vietnam War, but also kind of transferring into the Cold War and what that looked like, both at home and abroad. But very critically, ecofeminism at that time, and this continues now, was really based in race and class. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we continue on here this evening. But the roots of the movement that Epstein is describing in her essay also really struggled initially to move from theory to practice. Right, just because it can be really freaking difficult to get people on the same page. Now, one thing that Epstein talks about in her essay that I want to touch on before we move into our next essay is about the National Toxics campaign. And we'll talk about kind of the anti-toxic movement here in just a minute, but the National Toxics campaign was kind of a working class campaign, but it also shut its doors very shortly after this book of essays was published. But in its place, there were other national and international organizations that support grassroots organizations against toxic chemical dumping. So kind of that grassroots organizing that she talks about throughout her is present, but in a different way than in what she describes within the essay. So hopefully you're with me so far. Now, moving into, I guess I should say our next reading is not an essay, it's chapter 1 of Ecological Politics by Greta Gaard. And she kind of builds on that foundation that Barbara Epstein has just laid for us, and really kind of helps us to conceptualize the different paths or streams that kind of feed into ecofeminism. And she describes this as the geography of ecofeminism. I couldn't find a freely available illustration, but in the book, so you'll see that when you read it, she has this little drawing of like mountains with streams like flowing down into a mountain lake. And so I'll kind of be describing ecofeminism here as a lake, so like lake ecofeminism. But the streams that are feeding into this lake are the peace and anti-nuclear activism movement, feminist spirituality, animal liberation activism, environmental activism, the antitoxics activism. Remember from just a minute ago. But also, I think importantly, the path of lived experience. Now, I spent my kind of childhood, right, like we say pre-teen years in northern Utah, and so I grew up around mountains. And so her description of these mountain streams feeding into a lake it's very compelling to me personally. So I hope that you have something that you can kind of bring into your own mind to help you kind of conceptualize what this looks like, kind of to map it onto your own head. Now, as Gaard is talking about these different movements that are bringing people into the larger movement of ecofeminism, she actually points to a very significant moment in peace and anti-nuclear activism organizing. And that was a gathering at the Pentagon by ecofeminists. And it was in this gathering and in this protest that Grace Polly and Inestra King wrote the Unity Statement. And this statement is, and I quote, "We are gathering at the Pentagon because we fear for our lives. We fear for the life of this planet, our Earth, and the life of the children who are our human future. We have come here to mourn and rage and defy the Pentagon because it is the workplace of the imperial power which threatens us all." End quote. This is such a powerful statement to me, and I hope to you as well, because I feel like it really does a fantastic job of both kind of bringing the movement together into a single statement, and that can be really helpful, but also because I think that it really flies in the face of a lot of assumptions that people have about feminism. Right, that they are standing firm and resolute in a space and in a way of thinking that is very caring and nurturing. And I really appreciate that illustration. Now, this next stream bringing us into lake ecofeminism is of feminist spirituality. Now, here in chapter 1 of Ecological Politics, I hope you'll forgive me, the title of the book just flew clean out of my head there for a second. Right, she's describing to us kind of the spiritual lives of like kind of prehistoric humans, essentially. And she very specifically describes Neolithic goddess culture. And that within these cultures, and I'm quoting here, animals were domesticated for companionship, milk, or wool, but the diets of these societies was primarily vegetarian, end quote. And kind of just this idea that if you'll forgive me for pausing here for a minute, but the idea that the natural world can be cultivated for our good without being like dominated is something that I think is really important for us to think about. And I really enjoy thinking about the idea of devotion to nature and what that could look like in a modern context. And it's really thinking about that devotion that brings us into our animal rights stream of ecofeminism, where we would think about, quote again, oppression of animals as part of a larger oppression of nature, end quote. Now, there are ecofeminist groups like the Vine Sanctuary that work to build bridges around animal liberation, environmental and social justice movements to really kind of bring us back in a positive way to that goddess culture where like humans and animals are companions rather than as adversaries or in kind of like a domineering type relationship. But of course, that's not the focus of all ecofeminists, and this brings us into environmental activism. Now, what we might think about a lot, when we're thinking about environmental activism, are it's probably the most visible, right, of like types of ecofeminist activism, right? Like you might think about things that could be described as stunts by like Greenpeace and organizations like that. But there's one little nugget of environmental activism that Gaard described in this chapter that I thought was really compelling. Right, she's describing women who have been active in various environmental organizations, but women who really are struggling because they're working side by side with men who can have who had some really sexist attitudes. Now, the scenario that she describes here in chapter 1 is the protestation of like deforesting regions, kind of like on the western coast of the United States. And there were some really, I will say, like visible forms of protest against deforestation, and we'll talk about that a little bit in a minute, how that manifests in other countries. But what women in this movement in the United States wound up doing was something a little bit more covert that I found to be kind of delightful and also funny, and not funny in a like teasing or making fun of kind of a way, but implementing a technique called yarning, Now, I think a lot of us, if we're thinking about yarning, we might think about like telling a tale, right? But what this group of women would do would be to take actual yarn and basically build webs out of it between the trees. And this was something that was really critically, I'm using the word critical here, but I think what I actually want to say is this is something that is very unique to the group of women organizing the protest, which is a really big deal. But it was the method that they chose because, again, you can do it covertly. So you're really minimizing your risk of arrest. You can also do it at times when it's convenient for you, so you're not as worried about childcare, which is something that was cited in this chapter. But also, and this is really why I think that it's funny, they chose yarn for this type of environmental activism because really the only way to get it down is to cut it down with scissors. And so it also wound up being somewhat demeaning to the loggers who were chopping these trees down because they're in the mindset of needing to use power tools, right? Chainsaws, things like that. And so it gets them to also take a minute to question their own masculinity in using a daintier tool. Now, this was something that was actually really effective, which I think is just delightful. We're almost through this chapter. It was a long one. But this next stream of activism, antitoxics activism, is one that was founded in the Great Lakes region of the northern United States, and really came about because women started finding links between hazardous waste dumps that were relatively common, until pretty recently. Unfortunately, they're kind of becoming common again. But finding links between things like breast cancer and childhood leukemia. Now, this isn't something that is unique just to the United States. Of course, I've said this before, and I'm sure that I'll say it again. I do focus on the United States because that's where I was born and that's where I live. But Canada and England also had their own antitoxics organizing that I find to be really quite compelling. Now, finally, we have our last stream into Lake Ecofeminism, and that is the path of lived experience, or in other words, just your lived experience that makes you an ecofeminist, and that is really whether it's through a very specific encounter with nature, or with a lifelong association with the natural world. Now, in the written module, I refer to one of my favorite children's stories, The Three Billy Goats Gruff. And that was a story that I, in my own childhood imagination, lived. It was one of my favorite stories, but also, again, as a child growing up, I grew up really kind of in the Wasatch Range, if that's something you want to look up or that you're familiar with. And so my family would go hiking a lot, and we had a favorite path with a bridge that crossed a stream. And so I spent a lot of time as a kid imagining that I was one of those billy goats, and that the troll living under the bridge was going to stop me from making it into the woods. And it can be something as small as that, right? Your favorite childhood story, hiking with your family. Clyde talked about fishing with his mom in the comments to this week's module, which I thought was just so delightful. Um, uh, but it could also be kind of a bigger event, and all of that is okay. Now, there is a lot more in chapter 1, but for this very specific module, I am going to leave it there to kind of give you some time to think about how these mountain streams might ebb and flow together to create this rich mountain valley wetland of ecofeminism. All right, now our final article here for the week is called Feminism and Ecology by Inestra King. Now, this was one that is also published in Toxic Struggles, the Theory and Practice of Environmental Justice. And I think that she really does, again, a really good job of kind of talking through maybe some of the finer points of basically the version of patriarchy that we're living under is the bad guy. But one thing that I really appreciate that she talks about is the way that variety of patriarchy starts very young. And she talks about this really much more articulately than I ever could hope to. Maybe tonight, now that that's hard to manage, I really have been stumbling over my words quite a bit. But she says, and I quote, "The process of nurturing an unsocialized, undifferentiated human infant into an adult person is the bridge between nature and culture. The Western male bourgeois subject then extracts himself from the real of the organic to become a public citizen, as if born from the head of Zeus. He disempowers and sentimentalizes his mother, sacrificing her to nature." End quote. So really, in short, the version of patriarchy that we are living under is designed to stop those that nurture from crossing the bridge in between nature and culture. Now, this is a bridge that I think is beginning to be repaired. And King tells us, and notably, she's not the only one who tells us about this movement, but she tells us about the Chipko, or tree-hugging movement in India. Now, this is a movement that is born out of Gandhian nonviolence, and is a movement in India led by women to save critically important forests by hugging trees. Now, one thing that I think is really important for us to think about and to speak aloud is that tree hugging might just kind of sound like it's lightly adorable. And like maybe it is. And also, it's a critically important and deeply effective form of nonviolent protest and ecological stewardship. Now, similarly to the women I was talking about a few minutes ago who were yarning, The Chicpo movement understands that preservation of the land, water, air, and energy is not an abstraction, but a clear part of the effort to simply survive. And that's really where I think we're leaving with ecofeminism this week, is that it's a movement that really encourages us to think about how we conceptualize gender roles, how those gender roles impact how we treat the natural world, but also how critically important the natural world is to our survival. And I think that it's going to be really helpful for us to think about how we can maybe get back a little bit closer to what was described earlier in the Neolithic period of living a little bit more in harmony with nature, particularly in the modern era. And we'll be talking about this more over the next few weeks too. And what it's going to take for us to really live in an environment where we can appreciate the people around us, but also the way that nature sustains us and that we can sustain the natural world. So thank you so much for your time this week. I really am looking forward to being in your inbox again on Sunday, July 19th. And to have the chance to sit down with you again next Wednesday, July 22nd. So I will see you all in just a few days. I hope you have a good rest of your week.